I know how to do it.
Yes, you do. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to your Bedroom Super Producer podcast. We are your hosts. My name is JT.
And I'm BK.
The good folks behind delicatebeats.com, your source of presets, sample packs, books, everything for the modern urban producer. And BK, today we are doing things a bit differently, aren't we?
Well, yes, indeed. Today we are talking about a major corporation who, in my humble opinion, changed the face of music and especially electronic music and defined pretty much all the music that came in the 1980s and moving forward. So who are we talking about this week, JT?
It's certainly part of the big three, and I'll even venture into controversial territory once again to start things off. I'm going to say that it is the most influential gear company pretty much on Earth. We are talking about the Roland Corporation.
Oh, yes.
And so, should we tell our listeners a bit more about how this whole thing started?
Yeah, we could start with that. So Roland started in Japan, Osaka, Japan, by a lovely gentleman named Mr. Kakeyashi, who started the Roland Corporation. Ikutaro Kakeyashi, who started the company in 1972. After he started, so basically Roland was his second company, because I think his first company was named Ace Tones. Ace Tone was a company that produced the first rhythm machines, the first drum machines that were built for like organ players. So they built those first rudimentary drum machines. Nothing,
the Rhythm Ace,
exact, like nothing like what we have today. But I think it was something interesting that was kind of foreshadowing what was to come with Roland Corporation. Like you said, he created the Rhythm Ace. I think it sold pretty well. I think he had a commercial agreement with Hammond. I think Hammond. They built those rotary Hammond. They built those rotary speakers and organs. At some point, I think he got tired of it. I think he didn't like the commercial aspect that was involved or what he was getting from them. So he just left Ace Tone and started his own company. And Roland was born in 1972.
Exactly. And I think what's really impressive about Mr. Kakeyashi is the fact that he was always very turned to the future. Even in the 60s, creating drum machines and organs and amps must have been very revolutionary. I mean, I wasn't born, so I wouldn't know, but and I think that's one thing that he carried on as a vision for Roland as soon as 1972 when they actually founded the company.
Exactly.
And so the Roland journey started with another drum machine, the Rhythm 77 or TR-77. It was the first of the TR line. And for those who don't know, TR, and I learned that through my research, is short for transistor. Let me see, transistor rhythm. So back in those days, and that's where it really makes you marvel at the human genius, because back in those days, a kick drum, a snare drum, a clap, they were all electric currents going through different circuitries or circuit patterns, and the way it went and stopped and got out of those circuits created different sounds. Obviously, I'm very much generalizing here. You might be more able to explain to us how exactly it works, but it was very, very futuristic.
Well, basically, it was synthesized, right? It was synthesized sound. That's how they did it at first. And why they called it transistor rhythm, it was because before the TR series, before the invention of the transistor, everything else had like it was lamps that were in amps, that were in circuits. To create those specific circuits, you would use like valves, like basically a kind of a sort of a light bulb before an electric circuit. So already Roland was already very forward thinking. They started using the new technology, invented the transistor, and that's how the TR series was born.
That's amazing. And as soon as 72, they also ventured into the world of guitar pedals with the Biba Fuzz pedal.
For me, the first pedal that I know of from the Roland Corporation was the Bose, but it was that super chorus that they did.
Yeah, the CE1.
Yeah, that's the first one I know of. I don't know about the other. What did they do before?
So the Biba Fuzz was the first pedal, but to the point you just made, as soon as 72, Roland was already creating a second corporation in Boss. And obviously Boss has grown into like a multinational on its own, creating, all of these legendary stomp boxes. But I think that it just goes to show, again, to the genius, the business savvy of Ikutaro Kakehashi, because he didn't have enough with just the synthesizers and the effects. He needed also the stomp boxes.
The genius also behind was also like a commercial genius, because he created multiple businesses to sell all these different products. Because Roland was mainly, I think, the more professional gear oriented towards musicians and things like that. But he also had like lower stuff, and I think he had a corporation for more commercial audio and video stuff. And there's also I think we remember Edirol, like they used to make those cheap sound cards and like those weird little things. But it was also forward thinking to have different companies who offer different level of different products, so that you have something for the mainstream, you have something for more professional, you have something for, at some point that was gonna be DJs. And so he was very visionary business person.
Yeah. Well, actually, to your point, among the big threes, there was Roland, Moog, and ARP in the 70s. And Moog and ARP were creating much more expensive bits of kit, whereas Roland, when they started, they wanted to include the hobbyists.
Yeah, so their stuff was a little bit less expensive. Even like a keyboard for $5,000 is still pretty expensive, but they had a pretty broad range of keyboards that could apply to professional and consumer.
So let's keep going through the timeline, because, and obviously we won't be able to cover all of the different legendary pieces of gear that Roland created, because they're in the thousands. But their first synthesizer was born in 73, and that would be the SH-1000. And what can you tell us about the SH-1000, Beak?
I think the SH-1000 was like a very rudimentary synthesizer, right?
If I remember correctly, it was partially modular, where you had the main unit, and then you could plug in other units. Or is that, no, that's the System 100.
No, that's the System 100. SH-1000 was, I think it was like a monophonic, kind of looked a little bit like an organ, but it was like one oscillator.
Yeah. It's the one with the colored
with
little
some, little pedals under it, I think, with like
to trigger the presets. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like normal subtractive synthesis, like on normal keyboards. I think it had maybe 10 presets or 15 presets, something like that. I think it was
And they were all like supposed to be real world instruments, like trumpet, piano.
yeah. But
Do you know
still,
what it
still a
reminds me of?
pretty attractive venture. They made it for quite a long time. I think they made it for like 8 to 9 years, I think.
It sounds like the synthesizer sound at the beginning of The Shining to me.
Yeah. Maybe.
Obviously with less distortion and reverb, but it really sounds like fake trumpets out of a Bach recreation of some kind. That's how I see the 1000.
But lots of people used it. It had a pretty small keyboard. I think it was a 37 keys, but lots of people used it. I think like Giorgio Moroder used it. People like Jet Routal used it. So Vangelis, I think, even used it for some tracks. I'm not sure he used it
most probably
for Blade Runner, but so yeah, an incredible little small keyboard for 1970, 73 you said? Yeah, 72, 73.
And I learned that SH actually stands for synthesizer.
Yeah, in Japanese.
Which is the Japanese word for synth.
Yeah,
I never knew that. So that's something else. And so in 74, they create maybe the most iconic echo/delay module that still keeps getting replicated in plugin form. And that would be the RE201, the Space Echo.
I think I've never seen so many plugins of something like that. It was a pretty special device, that Space Echo, because it relied on real tape that would bend and swirl inside a special casing, and the casing was made in a way that the tape wouldn't get tangled together. So I think there was like a top that was matched to the thickness of the tape, so that when you would apply this certain delay, when the tape head would ride on it, you could have almost like infinite delays depending on the length of the tape that would roll up inside the machine. So that was pretty incredible.
Yeah, indeed. I have no idea still to this day how a tape machine works or a tape delay works, but I have seen those coiling tapes inside of the little metal box inside of the Space Echo, and it's really something to see in action. And it was even so popular. Actually, I would go as far as saying that it was their best commercial success out of the gates, really, because a lot of the pieces of gear that we're going to cover today were actually flops at the beginning. But the Space Echo sure wasn't one of those, and it stayed in production for 16 years.
Yeah,
so
yeah, people really loved it.
That's quite impressive.
But it also had like a spring reverb in it, and I think, like I said earlier, the fact that you could vary the length of the delay that you could have it, and the delay could be super long because the tape inside was pretty long. Because basically, what you do is that you record your sound on the tape, right, and then you replay it depending on the setting. If you want to replay it in 2 seconds or 3 seconds, depending on the type of delay that you're asking for, you can do it. So everything is dependent on the length of tape that you have, and then the sky's the limit. And if you have, like I said, the extra spring reverb that they provided, well, it becomes a pretty a very versatile unit.
The Space Echo is actually the only reason I still keep Guitar Rig installed on my computers, just to have that version of their Space Echo in there. Because for some reason there's no other plugin for me that does it quite like the one in Guitar Rig.
Oh, there's plenty of good stuff in Guitar Rig, plenty of amp stuff and amp head that you can have fun with.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned earlier in the episode, Guitar Rig also has a great recreation of the CE1, the chorus ensemble pedal by Boss, which was manufactured first in 76, so 2 years later. So these things are literally like 40 years old now. It's incredible.
But at the same time, it's funny that like we look at these things, they're 40 years old, and we're saying they're vintage. Like vintage, 40 years old. It's not that there's not that many years to have something vintage. I mean, if you have like let's say you have a Stradivarius violin or something, it's gonna be 300 years old or 200 years old, not like 50 or 40 years old. It's funny how that electronic gear and those synthesizers and those things, today we call them vintage, and they've been made only like 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I think it has to do with the ever increasing speed at which we innovate. Because between 70, right now we're in 74. Whatever happened between 74 and now is just really incredible in terms of, again, the human genius is just unparalleled. And and obviously now with the all software world, it's even way quicker now. So it's just it's tough to catch up.
And yet people still go back to those vintage synthesizers from the 70s and the 80s because they have that certain something that we can't even put our finger on it, and still people like the grit, the organic, the textures that these synths seem to put back in the tracks that are coming from straight inside the box. I don't know. Still people, they go back to it.
Well, I mean, I'm no electrical engineer, but I've read somewhere that if you open up and I don't want to jump the gun too much, but if you open up a TR-808, for example, and you look at the circuit boards and how they managed to create the sounds, I heard this guy in an interview say that it was really incredible the way they put those things together from a technological standpoint, like the craftsmanship for one, but also the ingenuity. Like they had to put together something that wouldn't cost $40,000, as we'll see with other other synthesizers that they've put out. Like they wanted to cater, like we said, to the hobbyists. Therefore, they had to work with certain restrictions in terms of what kind of pieces they could use to create the piece of gear.
Yeah, true. Especially that at the beginning the sounds were literally manufactured inside the box. They were made from the circuits, from the resistance, the resistors, from the amplifiers that were in the box. They nothing was sampled at first.
Yep. And then this takes us back to the Hans Zimmer episode, but 75 and 76, Roland put out two of the system synthesizer line, the 100 and the 700, which were both used by Hans Zimmer extensively. And I have a kind of a pop quiz for you.
That was
in 76 when they...
76, yeah.
Yeah, but 76.
There were two. There was the 100 and the 700, right?
Yeah. The 100 was first unveiled in 75, and then the 700 a year later. And so in 76, the System 700, how much would it go for in the States? So in US dollars.
The System 700?
Yeah.
I'm going to say $20,000.
Well, that's a lot of money, but the System 700 was actually going for, and I hope you're sitting down, $45,000. $45,000.
It's a lot of money.
That's in 76. That's like a house.
Yeah, exactly. So you had to choose. You had to have the money, and then you had to convince your wife.
Yeah. Well, you probably lost the wife really soon after.
Because you
just you need some time to work with that beast.
Yeah, you had to make a choice.
So if you guys out there have no idea what we're talking about, go look at the Hans Zimmer's studio on Google, and you'll see those walls of sound. And the one on the right is a 700. And funny story, he actually bought this from an old studio that had no use for it, and he actually bought the thing by the pound, literal weight, because the guy that sold it or had to get rid of it had no idea how much that thing was worth. And so Hans Zimmer's probably bought it for like $10,000 or something, which was still very expensive, obviously, but nowhere near like the actual price it was sold at initially. And so then we move on to 77, if I'm not mistaken. First sequencer, polyphonic one, the MC8. So nowadays we have DAWs. Back in those days, they had like beige boxes like the MC8 in which you could enter in musical phrases by like tapping those on like you know those old calculators that had the big buttons? Or actually like the numerical pad that you have on a computer keyboard, like it had that, and you would enter like the notes and the stuff on there, and you could actually enter like a maximum of 5,000 notes, and it was all polyphonic, and then you could save your compositions on cassettes, because once you turned off the MC8, you would lose all those 5,000 notes.
Yeah, that's a bit archaic, those micro composers.
Imagine the pain of
oh my God.
entering a song in that kind of machine.
Oh my God. No shuffle, no accents, no nothing.
Yeah, I don't think that a lot of people used it extensively.
But still the precursor of the DAW that we have today.
Yeah, well, again, goes to show you how fast we innovate.
Yeah.
And then 78, we see the first Jupiter.
Yeah, Jupiter 4.
Exactly. One of my favorites, actually. I really like I dig the look on the Jupiter 4.
Yeah, Jupiter 4, yeah, same thing. 4 voices. I think it was the beginning of a love story for Roland fans out there, because the Jupiter had many incarnation afterwards, right? It was still pretty expensive for a synthesizer. For 1978, I think it would be something like $2,800 US or something.
Yeah, well, it was built like a tank, so it must have been very heavy and very expensive. And to your point, I think that it was, maybe I'm mistaken with the 6, but didn't each of the voices have its own oscillator on the 4?
On the 8, it's 2 per voices usually.
I couldn't tell by looking at some pictures, but my notes read that it's actually 1 oscillator per voice, 4 voices. Yeah. So imagine the sound on that beast.
So they upgrade.
Right?
So they upgraded on the Jupiter 8 then.
I think the improvements on the 8 is more about, electronically keeping track of the presets, and so the first microchip where you could store presets was in 78, so on the CR78.
Yeah, that's a drum machine.
Therefore, you had that for the first time on a Jupiter product in the Jupiter 8 model. Yeah.
Exactly. The first microprocessor was on the CR78. The CR78, actually, the CompuRhythm, was the first drum machine that you could program.
Right.
So that was gonna lead to the iconic drum machines that we're gonna talk about a little bit later. But why don't we move on to the Jupiter 8 just to see the difference with the 4?
Of course. So 81, we see the birth of.
Actually,
would you say it's the Holy Grail?
The big thing on the Jupiter 8 was that on this time, that's why I was confused earlier on. The Jupiter 8 says 8. That means it was 8 voices.
Mm-hmm.
And 16 oscillators, high pass, low pass filters with selectable slope, 12 dBs and 24 dBs per octave. And like you said, since the advance of the microprocessor and the advance of memory, a 64 patch memory.
64 patch.
And also the awesome arpeggiator that the Jupiter 8 is known for. So that's why when it was brand new in 1980, it sold for more than $5,000 US.
How much does it go for now? Like
Today?
7,000 Canadian?
No. Today you can get one for like 2,000 or something.
Really?
Yeah,
Jupiterite?
Yeah. Depending on how the shape that it's in, you know.
So I want to backtrack, sorry, into 1980 because there was a very, very iconic piece of gear that was invented by
In 1980,
Roland. Yeah,
are we talking about a drum machine?
we are talking about a drum machine indeed.
Oh, I'm gonna guess it was the TR-808.
Oh, the TR-808.
Oh yeah, the misfit of the
We
drum
were talking
machines.
about flops that numerous flops actually that Roland had to deal with in all those years, and the TR-808 certainly was one of that. And I think you touched upon why it was so in our episode about trap music, and it was because why was it such a flop? Actually, I can't.
Well, it was a flop because people really thought that at that time people were looking for realistic drums. So slowly, that was the era. Like the 808 came and PCM samples were coming slowly.
Right.
Like we were talking about the Roger Lynn of this world, and so they were coming, the Lynn drum and everything they were. So the 808 is kind of it's just, for me, I call them space drums, but they're kind of it's new, but it's old school at the same time because they were still synthesizing the sound inside the box and the circuits. So there was no samples or anything. And musicians were looking for like real sounds, like real sounding sounds. So they weren't too keen with what the 808 was providing. But at the same time, it was the sound of the future. And I think maybe people didn't quite understand that when it came out. So that's why it was pretty much like a flop at the beginning. But in a way, it was a good thing that it was a flop because since they didn't produce that many units and they weren't selling, well, they lowered the price. The units that were already sold ended up in pawn shop, and then you got this brand new music revolution that came, pretty much hip hop, that started using these drum machines that were cheap, that you could get for a lower price at pawn shops, the only thing they could get, because before everything was live music, you had to get in the studio, get studio musician. It was very, very expensive. Now you got this box with futuristic sounds. That's the only thing you can get. And then awesome records started coming out of this little box, and you could hear these sounds like the beginning of the 80s and mid 80s, like Public Enemy stuff, and I think Beastie Boys stuff,
Run DMC,
Phil Collins,
Yeah.
Marvin Gaye,
yeah.
Sexual Healing, all these
Sexual Healing, Africa Bambaataa.
Cybertron, even Whitney Houston. So it's kind of strange that it wasn't a hit right away, but it still managed to make its way into pop/hip hop culture. And then afterwards, it also was the basis, the basic raw material for the whole Southern hip hop that came afterwards. All the bounce, the crunk, and that Southern hip hop that used the 808, the low sound, not the clicky one.
They were just
and the clap from the 808 to create a whole new genre that today is almost, we can almost call it pop music today.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a very good point. I mean, the 808 is known for the infamous kick, but the clap is as iconic as the kick actually is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, speaking of flops, a year later, we see two more unbelievable gray boxes come on the market that were also very poorly received by the music community. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Must be talking about the 606.
Yes,
And
one of my favorites.
And the 303, TB 303.
Yeah.
So yeah, those two gray boxes also had a pretty historical impact. You want to talk a little bit about the 606?
Sure. I mean, hey, did you know that when I lived at the loft,
you had a 606
upstairs,
and you didn't tell me.
My upstairs neighbor had a 606. And I spent an hour with him tweaking that beast. And honestly, I don't know if you remember that guy, but he had those exterior event loudspeaker types of speakers, and we would like fiddle on the 606 for hours on these speakers, and you can really tell the punch of an analog drum machine.
Yeah,
like when you have this size speakers, it's really something else. One of which has not been recreated in the boutique line, I think,
nope.
which might have warranted its place in the boutique line because it looks great. I mean, those things, aside from the fact that they sound unique, they also like really have this look. I mean, if you go back to the Ace Tone days, all wooden boxes and all of that, they were quite ugly.
Yeah.
But in the 80s, everything that Roland put out like on this more, I would say, hobbyist line of musical instruments, they all had really quite unique looks. You know, the Jupiter 8 with all the colors, the TR-808 with the red, orange, and yellow, and then, you know, those little gray boxes, as I've said. And then, so the TR-606 didn't sound like real-world drum instruments. And as you said, like, Lynn was already on the PCM bandwagon with the real-world samples, and then Alesis and a bunch of others.
Yeah, so people were slowly turning to digital. They really wanted to go on the PCM side. So that was kind of the demise of those beautiful little boxes that was they still wanted to stay in that analog realm, and in a way it was perfect to start new genres, but it wasn't the right instruments if you wanted to keep doing jazz or keep doing pop or keep doing the stuff that was already there that was based on real music played in the studio. So in a way, it was their demise at the beginning, but it was great for them because they branched out into new music that was coming in the 80s.
And yeah, I mean, they had at some point to like switch gears and go towards like the more current technologies out there available for.
Yeah, but they did eventually.
They did, and I think that's
the
really
707. That was it.
Yeah, exactly. But the 707 and the 727, and for those who have no idea what we're talking about, they're both huge drum machines. The TR line again that were commercialized. I think they were sample based. They were, but they weren't huge hits though. Like after I think the 909 came out, and then. Or did the 909s come out after the 707?
The 909 was like 83, 84, and the 707 was like 85. And the 727 is kind of like an add-on to the 707, because the 727, they're like percussions.
Right, because I think the 909 actually has both. It generates most of the sounds still in an analog electrical fashion, and then you have the cymbals that are PCM samples, aren't they?
We can get into the 909 right away, and then we can come back to the TB303.
Of course, TB needs its own little segment for sure.
Actually, the 909, you're absolutely right. Most of the sounds are still generated in an analog way. If we're talking about the kick, clap, snare, toms, and everything, but the 4 cymbal sounds the hi-hat, the closed hi-hat, the open hi-hat, the cymbal, and the ride, those are sampled based. So it's kind of a hybrid, the 909. Also, the 909 is the first drum machine to have the infamous Midi protocol that was developed. So they say, like, history says that it was Dave Smith, right?
Yeah, he wrote a paper in 81.
Who wrote a paper and introduced the protocol, and then slowly the synth started having it. But if you read in between the lines and multiple articles on the web, you realize that Roland had already had its own protocol to sync its drum machines with its synth and vice versa.
I didn't know that.
They were developing something, and they were using sort of that same 5-pin connector system that Midi was using. So the credit is given to Sequential Circuit and Dave Smith, but I think it was a collaboration between these two giants, Roland and Sequential Circuit, to put out that protocol that we actually still use today.
Yeah, I think Yamaha was also involved, and maybe some other like big players.
Yeah, but if you take a look at what Roland had already created, and you take a look at what Midi is, it's really very close to their protocol. So I think they just matched like the best ideas from everyone, and then they established the protocol. So basically, if you come back to the 909, the 909 for me is, I know you're more an 808 type of guy. I'm more of a 909 type of guy.
Why is that?
Because for me, 909 means techno.
Yes.
For me, the 909 means house. And it was the beast that powered the house and the techno movement that was pretty much started 80, 85, Chicago. And then you have that whole Detroit underground movement. And that was the machine that was powering all these techno movements. And I was always a big fan of raves and electro when we were younger. And it's a staple of sound. You hear it, and right away you know it's a 909. Like Kraftwerk used it, Yellow Magic Orchestra used it, Björk used it, and on albums like in 92, 93. Orbital, Madonna, if you listen to Vogue, that's a 909. Of course, Jeff Mills, who doesn't know Jeff Mills, the Bells, that's a 909. And also, who else than Daft Punk and Revolution, 909, that's a 909 in there. So for me, it's one of those mythical drum machines. For me, it's even more mythical than the 808. Because like you recognize every single sound in the 909. Every single sound was overused in some songs. And the 808, I think it mutated. The basis was from the raw energy was from the TR-808, but then it mutated the 808s from the original 808 kick. It's not exactly the same ones that we have in hip hop music today. There's a little bit more pop to it. There's a little bit more distortion. It's kind of like the basis, but it changed. The 909, it seems that like purists didn't want to change it that much, and you recognize it like automatically when you hear it. But then again, like I said, I'm more on the electro side. You're more on the like hip hop side, so I think it was a perfect way for me to throw a little bit of oil on the fire.
Of course. I mean, I still hate the 909 with a passion to this day, but that's but to your point, I mean, to be fair to Roland, I mean, 99% of what people call an 808 today is not an actual 808, right?
Exactly.
It's just a sub bass with distortion and a specific envelope, but other than that, it's not a real 808. Do you know what my favorite 909 driven track is to this day?
I don't know.
It's a basketball favorite, and it's "Pump Up the Jam" by
Oh
Technotronic.
yeah, nice Technotronic, of course.
Sports banger number one.
Wow, but honestly, it was one of those machines that had so much good stuff in it when you think about it. Say, not just the 16 step sequencer that was already there on the 808, but the way you could control like the decay on every sound. That was a way to have a rhythm that was more human. The way you could accent all the different sound, that was also a way to humanize the sound. And that's why I think for me the 909 is superior. It even had, I think, like 2 or 3 levels of accents. So you could really play with it. Like today we can't even imagine like a drum box without accents, but in the past that was the way they would make it. And so the 909, that's how you can push the sound a little bit more. And of course, the ultimate feature on the 909, the swing and shuffle feature. So that's why for me it's the
Right, because there was no swing on the 808.
exactly. So if you combine the control of the decay, all the accent features, the level, the swing and shuffle feature, for me it's like an ultimate box that can be pushed. Either you can push against the beat, you can pull it, you can. For me, that's the strength of this machine.
And for people out there to grasp what you're describing right now, what's the name of the? He's either from Detroit or Chicago, but this black DJ who does like almost hour-long live presentations of the 909 on YouTube. What's his name?
Jeff Mills.
Okay, so that's the guy.
Yeah, Jeff Mills. If you want to know what the 909 can do, just go and listen to Jeff Mills, The Bells. That'll tell you everything
that's just
about the 909.
You can tell the guy knows the instrument. It's just
he knows it by heart. And I think by watching one of his videos, you see how he plays around with the sound and how he uses all those features, the accents and the swing and the shuffle and the decay on each sound to get that human back into the machine. That's
exactly
why the playability of the 909 I think is incredible.
Yeah, mixing in and out the sounds, and yeah, like you said, the decay is something that we don't hear people playing with the decay so much in like modern tracks. Really,
it's very effective when you have a sound that's created in an analog way, right?
Yes.
If it's a sample, I don't see how it's gonna, maybe like you're gonna have maybe a tail on it, maybe a little bit longer. It's gonna cut it short. If it's an analog sound, you pretty much control the way the sound is gonna sound, because you're actually adjusting the function of the sound, not just. It's kind of like a dynamic envelope. That's the way I see it.
Mm-hmm.
You're customizing your sound instead of just cutting it short at the end or making it a little bit long so I can hear a little bit of the resonance of the tail. So that's why it's so effective on an analog machine, because you're molding, you're mutating your sound by playing with the decay.
Because it's not just a volume thing; it's also a filtering thing. Right.
Yeah, exactly. You control the envelope, has a much more impact on the sound when it's generated in an analog way.
And so, talking about the 909, and we've mentioned very quickly another iconic gray box. Why don't we talk about acid music?
So, the 303 is kind of the iconic bass for acid tracks. The 303 is kind of in the same generation as the 909, because it basically came out well, it came out before. It's pretty much in the same generation as the 808. 808, 606, and 303. Those three boxes pretty much like 1980, 1981. And the 303 had pretty much the same issues because it was a bass instrument, bass line, 303. That's why it's called. That's why it's a TB instead of a TR. So people were looking for realistic sounding bass or a way to program a bass line easily. That's what they were looking for. So
like
either they will
accompaniment type thing.
Exactly, to accompany or to record your own tracks, or the same thing. You want a drum or you want a backing bass line. The problem with the 303 is that it did none of those things. It didn't sound like a real bass, and it also wasn't very friendly to program. It was actually very, very difficult to program all the sounds. And add to that another thing, the original ones that came out from Japan didn't have a user manual in English. The user manual was in Japanese.
Imagine that.
So doesn't sound like a bass, very hard to program, and we don't have a user manual. So it was three things that contributed to not being a very good seller when it came out in 81. But once again, since it didn't sell, the price came down, and once people got tired a little bit of disco and started burning all the discs and everything, a new movement started to appear. Acid, electro, more repetitive. And what best way to have an awesome bass of the future than the TB303? So it got its second life in, we could say, 85, 86, 87. Started mostly in Detroit, then crossed the ocean, UK, starting being part of the rave scene, and then you have all these bands, these KLF, Massive Attack, 808 State, Orbital, all these guys loving and wanting to have those squelchy liquid metal melting bass lines that the TB303 is well known for.
Yeah, it seems that we always need a good bloke to go to the far left and tell us what to use these boxes for, because they seem to be all British, really, those pioneers.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes when it's difficult to use, it's a good thing because you find original ways to use it and challenge your brain to find ways to use things that are not necessarily user-friendly.
At that time, it was also very, very rough for most of these companies. Like in the mid-'80s, like I'd say from 85 to 87, a lot of people went out of business. Companies such as Sequential Circuits. I think Moog had it rough too at the end of the 80s.
Yeah, that could be. We could maybe have another podcast on this, maybe to recap, talk about a little bit about Moog and Sequential Circuits and ARP and Buckler and all these awesome synth maker from the 70s and the 80s. But you're right, they were having issues mainly because they had built businesses around the fact that everything was analog. It took an enormous amount of time to build these machines. Almost all were custom. Very, very, very expensive. So most of these companies, they went out of business. So they weren't there in the 80s anymore. And I think my theory is that Roland found a way to navigate those difficult waters, because as we said in the beginning of the show, they had found a ways to diversify. Exactly. They weren't only making $5,000 Jupiters. They were making all kinds of stuff. They were making drum boxes. They were making Jupiters. They were making more commercial stuff for audio, for video, like commercial endeavors. And like you said, they also had their sister company, Boss, which were making incredible guitar pedals that were very popular with guitar players, and that started to grow enormously with all the bands and the glam bands and the rock bands that were starting to emerge in the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. So I think it's the diversification that they came out as winner at the end.
Yeah, I mean, they were really one of a kind when it came to diversification, especially in the 80s where, like you said, everybody was doing analog, and then Yamaha killed the whole thing with the DX7. Like everybody wanted the electronic, like a
people wanted a different sound.
Synthesizer.
They wanted like digital. That's all they wanted, or sample based or digital. So of course the analog we're gonna die off.
And then, like you said, all those squelchy bass lines actually, I think it was in around 87, like literally created a worldwide movement and a resurgence of musicians wanting to work with these old boxes. You know, the 707 came back into fashion, the 727, the TB303, the 909.
And they started to get more expensive and as they went along, because there were only a certain amount that were made. The TB303, they only made like 10,000. So they started to get super expensive because they weren't producing them anymore. So
yep, go on eBay and look for a TB303. You'll see that they go for a lot of money.
Yeah, that's right.
I've been there, and I decided to get some plugins instead.
Yeah, indeed. So
talking about plugins, another really, really cool synthesizer came out in 87, the D50.
I know it. I don't know it by heart like I know the other ones.
So the D50 was the first digital synthesis board made by Roland. So you had samples and digital synthesis, like digital modulation and envelope. And so it really created out of this world sound. And if you watch any 1980s and 1990s documentaries, stuff like, Unsolved Mysteries or, certain more spacey stuff, you'll hear the D50. And it has quite a tacky yet legendary sound also. And do you know who the head sound designer was at Roland doing all of the presets for the D50?
I have no idea.
So that would be Spectrasonics' founder, Eric Persing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had heard that he had a history with an old company for synth, but I didn't know it was for the D50.
Yeah. So it's no surprise that Omnisphere is such a modern classic, really, because the guy Persing was really, really climbed the ladder, if you will, in the synthesizer game. So he really understood what it took to create a great synthesis engine. And honestly, I almost bought the boutique version of the D50 a few months ago. Like, there's really something about the sound. It's just it's in an era in and of itself, like the Jean-Michel Jarre and the Enya sound was really pioneered on the D50 by these people. Like the tacky 90s sound is really the D50, if you ask me.
That's awesome. Let's
move into the 90s and look at what innovations Roland came up with. On my list, I've got the JV 1080. An aspect that you've kind of hinted at but didn't really tackle head on was the general Midi thing that happened in the 80s. Yes, so as we've said, Roland, Yamaha, Korg, Sequential Circus came together based on the Dave Smith paper and created and standardized Midi. And obviously, Midi has a much different signification today because we don't have to plug in, 5-pin cords between all of our boards like we used to. Now, Midi is just a cable that you plug in your MIDI controller and in your laptop, and that's about it for Midi now. But back in those days, if you wanted all your synths to play together, you had to connect them through Midi so that they would pass like the rhythm information, tempo, and a bunch of other things. And around the same time, computers and home computers came on the market, and like especially for the gaming scene, you needed sounds. Roland was the first company to try to improve the quality of those sounds because game developers were not, necessarily targeting a specific piece of hardware to replay the sounds. They came up with this instrument standard that was communicated through MIDI, and that was General MIDI. So General MIDI sound number 1, for example, was a piano. And there I think you had either 128 or 256 sounds. I can't remember exactly. And then even on a General MIDI drum kit, like a C1 or C2 was the kick. And then would that be D1 would be the snare, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Also, I think it was General MIDI that introduced the whole like the maximum of 128 possible program numbers or something.
Yes, exactly.
Stuff that we take for granted today, but it all came from that protocol.
And so this very long diatribe of mine, I'm using this to introduce the idea that through General MIDI, Roland started to create those boxes that it called Sound Canvas. And I actually owned one of those in the very late 90s. And they were based on the General MIDI protocol where, the first few sounds would be pianos, and then you'd move on to organs, and then you'd move on to maybe wind instruments. And then in the 60 or something, it was strings, And the JV1080 was the climax of this type of technology, like the most evolved 2U rack mount synthesizer engine that could, for one, replay your video game sounds, but you could also use as a full-on studio synthesizer.
Yeah, the expansion slot also that you could add.
More for orchestral stuff,
more like timbrality, more polyphony, and all kinds of like different data card or like expansion stuff, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I remember it was way too expensive for us back when we looked at them, but it seemed like an incredible, like if you looked at the rack mount when we looked at the old rack mount from even Timberland and the Neptunes, you would always see a JV or a couple of JV 1080s in there, and like from Roland.
Yeah, you would see the JVs. You would see the EMU stuff later on, and so what kids don't necessarily know is that back then you wouldn't like torrent a software synth. You would actually have to buy one of those big ass boxes that would cost anywhere from $3,000 to $8,000. So it was really something else. And
well, anyway, computer power wasn't up to the level that we have it today. So that's why they had those specific boxes. So you couldn't, those boxes were tailor-made. They had a specific processor, a specific amount of memory, expansions. They were kind of like mini computers optimized to be able to play those voices. And back then, like one of the, like a JV 1080 or whatever, you could have up to like 64 voices of polyphony. That was unheard of for a sampler. Say that was before contact. People don't realize that there was a before contact, and before contact, you needed one of those beasts to be able to play a 64 voice at the same time if you needed to.
And actually, you know what? 96 is the year I saw my first Sound Canvas box. And I'll always remember that historical moment. I was at Pins, and I've name dropped this friend of ours a few times on the podcast already, because they were always avant-garde when it came to technology. But in their house, they had this home electronic piano, on top of which was sitting two things, a Macintosh 2 and a Sound Canvas box. And they were the first family that ever had, a MIDI rig where you could actually, pre-program your lines in the Macintosh. That's an Apple computer, by the way. And you could have all these lines be replayed by whatever instrument you wanted. And once I saw that, first of all, I stopped playing video games, because the guys would go downstairs, play PlayStation, and I would ask politely to just stay upstairs and play with the Sound Canvas box. And a few years later, I actually got my own, a different model. They had the dark gray one, the first one that came out. I had the beige one that came out a bit later with like pretty much the same sounds. But that's actually what got me into producing music on computers.
Wow.
Yeah.
Humble beginnings.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because as we've said, they were not cheap.
Yeah, indeed.
You needed anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000 to get one of those Sound Canvas boxes.
Oh yeah, it's impressive how much we have today.
We're spoiled.
Yeah. Oh, we're so spoiled.
When we were talking about string libraries off air, and if you heard the strings that were on one of those, like the SC55, SC stands for Sound Canvas, you would probably cry or laugh or both.
Oh, the general MIDI stuff was, oh my God, it didn't sound too good.
Yeah, there was no legato, let's just say that.
Oh,
So those were iconic in my view, because they really took us from the hardware. You had like those huge sound banks, and then they took us right into more software sampler banks, in terms of what you would use as a home-based producer.
Yeah, exactly.
A few years later, 97, we saw another very iconic electronic instrument. Do you know what I have in mind?
97?
Well, it catered to a category of musicians we haven't talked about so much, the drummers.
Oh, the V-drums. It was a pretty incredible machine already, because just the fact that you had the rim shot possibility, and you had that little foam on top of you had almost it was almost like a real skin.
Exactly.
So you had a rebound to it. Maybe not all the V-drums. Some V-drums were like hard, but subsequent ones had a very realistic feel to them, and pretty incredible invention for drummers who wanted to practice in their condos.
Exactly. And
yeah.
As you said, like Roland had already, developed the whole sensitivity technology for their pads, going all the way back to 85 actually, with the pad 8.
Yeah. With those octopads or those.
Yeah, octopad. The first few MIDI trigger devices.
So many great inventions, that company.
Yeah. And also the V-drums would have these boxes, like those external boxes for storing, hundreds, if not thousands of drum kits. So that was something really special. I mean, Butch, Alex, was the first one to actually purchase one of those. And my only interest was really just to rotate the dial to change the drum kits to see what they sounded like if they had a hip-hop one, because in 97 was when I started to really produced seriously for hip hop artists locally. Yeah. Another synthesizer from that era that I always wished I could put my hands on with this was the JP8000.
Oh yeah, that was an incredible synth. Wow,
Yeah.
the
So,
JP8000.
so I think it was
Wow.
the first entirely virtual analog synth by Roland. So no PCM samples. Everything was digital, and it sounded crazy. Like, and something that warrants more gratefulness for all of us musicians, the fact that they came up with the super saw waveform on that machine.
Yeah, that's true. The super saw was invented on that machine. I had forgotten about that.
I mean, we take it for granted nowadays. With Serum sound design, you can, you know, ramp up the unison voices like to, I don't know, 16 or something. You know that better than me, but like, I mean, 80% of the big chord sounds that we hear today is actually based on that idea of a super saw waveform, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true. That's totally true.
And if you go back again more in the 90s, it pioneered like the sound of trance, which might be a bit tacky for our tastes today, but in the late 90s, trance was the thing. Like it was, I remember like when my sister bought that, was it Robert Miles?
Yeah.
He was that pianist that did kind of trancey techno stuff. Like
Yeah.
the big super saw waveform was all over that stuff, Like it was really driving a whole industry. And another, let's move into the 2000s with another technology that Roland pioneered, and I think you'll have a lot of love for, is the Variphrase technology.
Yeah. Variphrase was pretty incredible. Pretty much the Variphrase is what we do with Ableton today.
Yes.
Right?
So time stretching.
So you could sample something in there. You could do time stretching. You could change the pitch without changing the speed.
Exactly.
Of your sample.
Which was unheard of, really.
It was unheard of back then.
Couldn't do both. You could do one or the other.
You could one or the other. You couldn't do both. So the Variphrase was it had the sampling engine, and the way it would chop up the things were very, very, very advanced. Maybe a little too advanced. I don't think people totally understood the whole thing with the Variphrase when it came out, aside from like the big studios and people who really knew how to push this machine to the limit. And it was kind of bittersweet because when it came out, almost maybe 1 year or 2 years later, or suddenly computers started to make huge leaps in terms of memory, in terms of processing power. So slowly, those boxes, the Variphrase, those music boxes that you talked about earlier, those rack synths and the Korg Tritons and the Yamaha, the Motif and everything, they sort of started to not be like studio, like aficionados still had them because they wanted a specific sound, but you kind of slowly started to see that they were gonna die at some point because computer were gonna be the viable option for the next years, right?
Of course. I mean, it was really another pivotal moment in like musical technology, just as much as there was a big shift from analog to digital in the mid 80s. Like computers, as you said, were doing just enough so that a person who didn't have $4,000-$5,000 to shell out on another box that did one thing, one incredible thing, but just one thing really. Because the VP9000, which is actually used on Discovery by Daft Punk, it was an incredible sampler, but at the time there were better samplers. Like, so why would you just get this one particular unit for Variphrase?
But I think the Variphrase, they could also, I think the robot voices that they made, the very phrase was like kind of tailored to do that, I think, right?
Well, yes, because you could actually reharmonize with Midi. So you
Yeah,
could
that's the
actually
thing.
play one sample on, like, create several voices of the same sample at different pitches, but with the
Yeah.
same tempo. So that was something that you had never seen before, or
Yeah,
heard before, should
exactly.
I say? Yeah,
Exactly. So that's why they were used by our friends, the robots.
yeah. And even the V synth didn't really catch on. I mean, I heard of the V synth through you because you were enamored with Amon Tobin, and he was like a notorious vsynth user. But other than that, I mean, nobody ever really got, or I've never seen a vsynth in a studio other than.
Well, they had the rack mount version, they had the keyboard, but no, that those huge workstations at some point they started to disappear because the fact that you had the option to work in the computer, it kind of didn't make sense to have just one piece of gear, very expensive piece of gear to make your music.
Yeah,
So
that's why, for me, like from 2004 to 2014, I would say, like, Roland really didn't put anything iconic. Like, they put out great pieces of equipment. Like the whole Phantom series obviously comes to mind. But that was like the decade of workstations, as you've said. The Triton and the motifs and the. Yeah. It's almost as if synthesis technology had gone to the to its furthest point, and then it was more about improving PCM samples quality, like the duration and the number of voices and all of that stuff.
yeah, true. Yeah.
And then basically we went into more of the deep sampling territory.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, I can't remember the first time I came in contact with Contact, but I assume it would be around 2010 or something, maybe even a bit earlier than that.
And the first iteration wasn't that good, but then when when Contact 2 came out, now that was interesting. That was interesting.
Yeah, that really rendered all of those huge workstations
Oh, it was
obsolete.
that was when it, because in Contact 2, I think, which was in 2005, 2006, I think.
Yeah.
You had pretty much the most powerful sampler on each key. You could like put anything, any amount of effects, anything on each key. You could have 100 samples on the same key, and you could multiply that by all the keys you had on the keyboard. And so the possibility, you weren't limited by sampling memory, you weren't limited by RAM, it was like something else. Like all those Akai sampler became obsolete in terms of power, but in terms of it depends. If you still wanted that grunginess from the noise from the converters and the way it chopped the thing not so perfectly, then that's something else. And as we see today, we're kind of going back around the circle. We want those imperfections. We want those analog issues. We want that little bit of not being quite in tune. We realize that we strived for perfection in the digital age, and now we kind of want to humanize thing and go back to that not so perfect analog electronic age.
Yeah. And I think that's the exact reason why Roland, amongst pretty much all of the companies, are coming out with the boutique line, which would
to recapture that magic that they had, and that those great, those little magical accidents that they had back in the 80s. So
and also the idea of putting your body into the mix, by turning a physical knob and hearing a sound evolve, creates for a completely different experience than tweaking everything on a screen.
Exactly. Like even a MIDI controller is not exactly the same thing. So yeah, you're totally right. That's exactly what I think they brought everything back, and it's also a way for a new generation to experience those incredible machines, stuff that you couldn't. You're not going to find a Juno 106 just at the corner pawn shop, but you can go and get the recreation pretty easily. Of course, it's not going to be the analog circuitry in it, because it's based on they're using ACB technology.
Yeah.
It's analog circuit behavior, but it's pretty damn close, honestly.
Oh, yeah.
If you take a look at if you look at the YouTube video, like a real one and a boutique, it's pretty damn close, because basically what they're doing, they're modeling like each resistor of the circuit. They're modeling the operational amplifier. So it's not just they're not modeling it like as a whole, like what comes in at one end and what comes out. That like you can't really model the behavior of every little changes that you're going to apply to it. But if you model every single piece of the original circuit, because basically to make the boutique series, they modeled like on existing analog units that they have at Roland in Japan. They modeled it on real units to make the boutiques. So it's pretty incredible.
And I think that they had ACB even before they actually unveiled it to the public. Like, there's so many synths in between, 2000 and today.
All the System 8 stuff has that. The TR8, that's what it uses.
Okay.
The System 1s, that's what it uses. So before the boutique, they were already the Jupiter that came out that like put all the Jupiters together. Or there was a version of the Junos also that I think put the Junos together. It's not Juno, but it's a System 1 or System 8 synth. The green ones, the one with the green lights on it.
Yeah.
It combines multiple. Well, that uses ACB.
Exact. I had that one in mind.
It sounds pretty good, honestly. It's not exactly the same thing, but it sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah, I overlooked all of those because I was still very much enamored with the analog boards. When they came out with those, I still wanted to put my hands on a Juno. And actually, funny that you mentioned that. We didn't really speak about the 106 or the 60 Junos, which were also very much defining pieces of gear that Roland put out in the mid 80s. Like the Juno 106 is like one of the best selling of all times.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it's the one one of those things from Roland that had the most potent implementation of Midi.
Yeah,
I think it was one that used it like to the maximum, because it was 106 was 84.
Yeah, 84. Hey, listen, let's start to wrap this thing up, because honestly we could go on forever. I mean, there's so many great pieces of gear and innovations that Roland came up with. I think that today's episode is really a testament to the importance of understanding history to appreciate just how lucky we are as musicians today, with all of the incredible pieces of software that we can get our hands on for really a tiny fraction of the price that what these advancements are based on in the real world, if you will.
Yeah, it makes you humble.
and it really makes you marvel at the genius of these people that really worked in the shadows. We don't even know their names, and yet entire industries are based on their work. We briefly talked about the video game industry that really it needs to pay homage to those people who created those horrible sound boxes that came as third parties. If you wanted to have a proper gaming rig, you needed to buy those super expensive boxes, and nowadays you have Hans Zimmer scoring your next thing, and it's all in the box, and you don't have to worry about sound cards and MIDI and all of that stuff.
Oh yeah, technically stuff was much more difficult in the past, before the whole like composing, before writing one note of music. Just to get to the stage of being able to write, you had to the amount of, in terms of time and money and technical abilities, and like even if you had the money, things didn't always tuck to each other. Like the protocols weren't all that different. Even after MIDI, it was still kind of a little bit difficult. I think at some point, I remember that it was even difficult just to exchange a file from a Mac to a PC. Just to show you how, like, today that's basic. You can even run Windows on a Macintosh if you want. But back in the days, there was a point where just exchanging a file, a simple file, from a PC to a Mac was complicated. So,
well, yeah, I mean, audio was AIFF on Mac and Wave on PC.
Exactly. And even if you did just like, even connecting like on the same server, Macintosh and a PC was complicated. So that's how you said, we don't realize how lucky we are that all these protocols today, they just talk to each other, and you can just worry about making the best music you can make with all the tools that we have today.
Yeah, so analog synthesizers, analog drum machines, guitar stomp boxes, amps, effects units, vocoders, string machines, organs, virtual drums,
electric pianos, all kinds of stuff, Roland.
MIDI,
percussions.
And then, as we said, sound cards, MIDI, general MIDI. Their legacy is immeasurable, really.
Immeasurable, yeah. Like for someone starting out, everyone who started out has to have a little something of Roland, just like something cheap that got them started into making music or to learn something. Everyone has something.
And even from the other side of things, entire musical genres, as you've said,
yeah,
acid house, drum and bass, trance, techno, hip hop. They all rely on innovations by this Japanese corporation.
Yeah, wow, incredible.
So thank you all for listening to us ramble about. This must have been our most advanced nerding session.
Well, there's a lot to cover, so it's it's interesting. So how can we stop?
So BK, take it away for us, please.
All right, guys. So like we say every week, have a great week. Make that great music, and we'll see you guys next week.
Peace.
Peace out. Thanks for listening to the podcast, guys. Remember to subscribe if you like what you hear. We're on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube. Also, if you want to support us, head on to delicatebeats.com. You can find our serum packs, our contact instruments, and also plenty of freebies if you subscribe to the newsletter. Don't forget to follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and once again, keep